Oh, hi, didn't see you there. So, funny story. This video that you're watching right now was originally intended to be a completely different video. It was meant to be a tutorial about how to migrate to an HDR workflow if you work in Adobe Premiere. Because, I've already made several videos about how to work in HDR in my preferred editing program, DaVinci Resolve, but I also recognize that there are a lot of people who use Premiere, and those people probably aren't willing to entirely switch editing programs just for the sake of working in HDR. So I set out to learn Adobe's HDR workflow so I could share it with you guys. I mean, on the surface it seemed pretty simple. You set your sequence color space to HDR, you interpret your footage as HDR, grade on an HDR display, and then deliver. It seemed pretty simple, right? But as I started to dig deeper and deeper, I ran into more and more weird issues that I just couldn't find good solutions to. And eventually, I came to the conclusion that I cannot recommend switching to HDR if you work in Adobe Premiere, because Adobe's HDR workflow is broken. And to be clear, when I say that it's broken, I don't mean that it's completely unusable. I mean, you can create HDR content in Premiere, people have done it. But I found so many features that are buggy, broken, or outright missing that I just can't recommend this to any serious professional outside of very specific circumstances. So this video is going to be a bit of a rant, and it's going to be a bit less scripted than usual because I just need to get this stuff off my chest. And I'm entirely open to the possibility that I'm doing something wrong and these problems are solvable, but I can't find good solutions for them, so the only thing I could think to do is talk about them in a YouTube video. Because I want Adobe's HDR workflow to be great. I want HDR to be easy and accessible to as many people as possible, but I don't think that can happen while Adobe is trying to cobble together an HDR workflow out of stone knives and bearskins. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about all of the problems that I've found with Adobe's HDR workflow. Okay, let's get started by following Adobe's official guidance for how to enable HDR in Premiere, and then I'll address the problems as they come up. The first step is to go up into the sequence settings, and we're going to change the working color space here from the default Rec 709 to one of the HDR options, either Rec 2100 HLG or Rec 2100 PQ. And by the way, don't get hung up on the fact that it says Rec 2100 instead of Rec 2020. They both use the same color primaries. Rec 2100 is just the technically correct name for what you get when you pair the Rec 2020 color primaries with an HDR gamma curve. So for our purposes, Rec 2100 and Rec 2020 mean the same thing. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and select Rec 2100 PQ, since that's what I'm used to working with on YouTube. Now we're also going to go ahead and enable maximum bit depth and maximum render quality, so that way we will get 10-bit color in the preview window. Next, we need to go into our project settings, and we're going to set the graphics white level. The graphics white level essentially specifies what brightness level in HDR should be considered white for the purpose of creating graphics and converting SDR content. So, for example, any white text I put in the timeline will be set at this brightness level, and any SDR content will have its white point set to this level as well. The only parts of the video that should get brighter than the graphics white level are specular highlights in HDR footage. Now, the default setting of 203 nits is a pretty common standard in the industry, so I'm going to leave it where it is. Now, to test the configuration, I'm going to go ahead and import a clip which was already encoded with Rec 2100 and PQ to see how Premiere handles it. Okay, so this looks very flat, but that's actually to be expected because this footage is recorded using a PQ gamma curve, and I'm viewing it on an SDR monitor, so of course the colors don't look correct. In order to get an idea of what's really going on in this footage, we're going to need to look at our scopes, because everybody knows the scopes never lie. right? I mean, the scopes would never lie, of course. It's not like the one part of the application that's specifically designed to give you an objective and accurate view of the image would ever just completely misrepresent the image for no discernible reason, right? I mean, it's not like anyone would ever screw that up, of course. Well, of course they did. Now, by default, the scopes will be in 10-bit mode, which actually does give us an accurate representation of the image here, but it doesn't give us any sort of scale for properly evaluating the brightness. We have a 0 to 100 scale on the left, and we have a 0 to 1 scale on the right, but neither of these represent the actual brightness in nits, which is important to know in HDR projects. So to get an accurate scale, we need to switch the scopes into HDR mode. Okay, so with the scopes now in HDR mode, we now have a proper scale on the left from 0 nits all the way up to 10,000 nits, and this corresponds to the PQ gamma curve. So this will tell us our actual brightness in nits. But hang on a second. When we switch the scopes from 10-bit to HDR, the bottom half of the waveform completely changed. Now it looks like the shadows of this image are completely crushed, but they aren't. In 10-bit mode, we can see an accurate representation of what our shadows look like, but the appropriate scale is missing. And in HDR mode, the scale is correct, but the actual waveform is not. So why can't the HDR mode use the same math to generate its waveform as the 10-bit mode and the float mode do? And for that matter, why can't we control the scale markings on the side of the waveform independently from the waveform itself? And why would you even have the broken math that generates this incorrect waveform in the application in the first place? Is it a bug? Like it's not supposed to happen this way? If it's a bug, why hasn't it been fixed in so long? And why is it like this? I don't understand. Okay, so in order to monitor the image correctly, we're going to want to use a proper HDR monitor anyway. And thankfully, this actually does work properly if you have the right hardware. You'll need a dedicated output card like this Blackmagic deck link in order to allow Premiere to control the display directly. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'd recommend watching this video I made talking about my HDR monitoring workflow in DaVinci Resolve. Anyway, all you have to do is connect the HDR mastering display to the output card, and then we're going to go up into Preferences, Playback, and we should see our Blackmagic playback device here. And we're going to hit Setup, and we're going to switch our color gamut to Rec 2020 PQ. We're going to hit OK. And then our HDR display is going to switch into HDR mode. And now we can see we have a proper HDR output on our HDR mastering display. And this is just about the only way to get a remotely accurate preview out of Premiere when you're working in HDR. Because if you'll remember, when we look at the Premiere window itself on our SDR monitor, the image displayed there is completely wrong. Now, we can sort of fix this, but not really. By going into Preferences, General, we can enable Display Color Management, which according to Adobe will automatically figure out the capabilities of our display and adjust the colors of the image appropriately so we get an accurate preview. And well, it sort of works, but it has some serious issues. For one thing, with the setting enabled, you now notice that the image is covered in this strange banding and other weird color artifacts that aren't present in the original file. And this is because, for whatever reason, in addition to considering the color space and gamma curve of my display, Premiere also looks at the ICC profile which is installed in my operating system. Now, if you don't know what an ICC profile is, let me explain. It's a profile which your operating system associates with a particular monitor and uses to convert the raw color information it generates into something that will look correct when viewed on that particular display. These could be used to, for example, transform an sRGB image produced by the OS into a different color space and gamma so that a wide gamut monitor will display it correctly. But they can also be used to adjust for color distortions which are specific to a particular monitor. It's common practice for creative professionals to use a color probe to measure the inaccuracies of a specific monitor, and then generate an ICC profile which will correct for those distortions and effectively calibrate the monitor. Now in my case, I have an ICC profile installed which does exactly this. I generated it using a display calibration software, and now Windows will automatically run everything through that profile so that it will be color accurate. So there's no need for Adobe to do anything with the ICC profile in this case, because Windows is already handling that adjustment. And yet Adobe does look at the installed ICC profile and uses it to do something, which ends up distorting the image dramatically. And even when it's viewed through my display's inaccuracies, it still doesn't look right. And I know that it's the ICC profile causing the problem, because when I change the ICC profile in Windows to a generic sRGB one, the problem goes away. Now look, it's completely possible that I'm doing something wrong here. I'm entirely open to that possibility. But whatever's going wrong, I haven't been able to find any clear answers to it in Adobe's documentation. Adobe says that Premiere will just automatically figure out the best way to give you an accurate preview, but clearly in this specific circumstance, it's not doing it right. Something's going wrong that's giving me a completely distorted and inaccurate image here. And to make matters worse, there's no way to tell Premiere to perform the HDR to SDR conversion without also enabling this faulty ICC correction. The SDR conversion and the ICC profile correction should be two separate settings, but they're not. You can't enable one without also enabling the other. And it doesn't even stop there, because that HDR to SDR conversion isn't even all that good. It has its own problems. For one thing, even when I switch away from the bad ICC profile, these shadows are still completely crushed, and I don't know why. And for another, this conversion will prematurely clip HDR highlights. Looking at this especially bright scene, it looks like almost the entire image is clipping, but it isn't. Looking at the scopes and on the HDR monitor, we can see that there's actually plenty of detail which we aren't seeing. The reason for this is that Premiere is only showing us the range from 0 nits up to our graphics white level of 203 nits, and it's hard clipping anything above that. To demonstrate this, watch what happens if I go into the project settings, and I change our graphics white level now to 300 nits, and you'll see that that reveals more detail. Now I can sort of understand the rationale behind this, since Premiere is choosing to only show us the range that our SDR monitor can reliably reproduce. But I also sort of disagree with this, because it may lead users to think that their highlights are clipping when they actually aren't. A better way to handle this, in my opinion, would be to smoothly roll off those out-of-range values so the user can still get a rough idea of what their highlights look like, even if their display can't properly display the entire contrast of the image. This is what Resolve does, and it looks much better in my opinion. This problem is made even worse by the fact that SDR exports of HDR timelines exhibit the same behavior. If you want to render an SDR version of your project and select Rec 709 in the export settings, then the resulting file will also clip the highlights which are above the graphics white level, making the SDR conversion look much worse than it could otherwise. This behavior may be acceptable in the preview window, but it certainly isn't for rendered files. I don't know many people who would rather have their highlights hard clipped when they could be smoothly rolled off. Okay, so moving on, let's take a look at how we're meant to handle other kinds of footage. Thus far, we've been working with a file that was already encoded in HDR PQ. But a lot of the time, you're going to end up working with footage that was recorded with a camera log format, so its source, color space, and gamma curve will have to be converted to HDR for editing. So for example, let's take a look at handling this footage that was recorded using slog3. If I right-click on the footage and go to Interpret Footage, there will be an option at the bottom to select which format the clip was encoded with, so that Premiere can perform the appropriate conversion. Except, wait, these are our only options? So we got Rec 709, Rec 2020, Rec 2100 PQ, Rec 2100 HLG. Those are basically just the same options we had in our timeline. There's no slog3 option. There's not really any camera log options here. So unless our footage was encoded in one of these specific formats, which it very likely wasn't, Premiere won't be able to automatically convert it to HDR. Instead, we'll have to use an external program like Resolve or LUT Calc to generate a LUT that converts our camera log footage into Rec. 2100 PQ, and then tell Premiere to use that LUT instead. So for example, I've generated this LUT in Resolve, which converts slog3 into Rec. 2100 PQ. If I select this LUT, and then change the source color space to Rec. 2100 PQ, then I can see that the slog3 footage is being converted into HDR as it should be. But although this may look like a perfectly fine solution, it isn't. The purpose of a color management system is to preserve accurate color throughout every step of the post-production process. In order to achieve this, it needs to be internally consistent. That is, you should be able to apply and reverse transforms as many times as you want in whatever order you want, and as long as the beginning and ending format are the same, the results should be the same. For example, in Resolve, if I have a pair of identical clips here, and I decide to send one of them into Fusion, then the software will automatically convert that clip to linear to apply the visual effects, and then convert it back to my timeline format afterwards. But because the color management system is consistent, applying and then reversing the transformation to linear has no effect on the colors of the clip, which still look identical to the version without any visual effect applied. This is how it's supposed to work. However, this is not the case in Adobe's software suite. Because the initial transformation from the camera format to the timeline format is being performed by an external LUT generated in a different program, it's very possible that the transform in question is not consistent with the transforms used internally by Adobe. To use the same example again, let's look at what happens when we have a pair of identical clips here and we decide to send one of them to After Effects for visual effects work. So inside of After Effects, we'll need to set up our color management to be the same as the color management we used in Premiere. So we'll go into Set Project Working Space, and we'll need to make sure that the color processing is set to 30-bit 2 bits per channel float. And then the working space should be Rec. 2100 PQ. And from there, we'll need to go back into the interpret footage of our clip and apply the same transform that we did in Premiere. Oh, well, it looks like in After Effects, there's no option to apply a LUT to the footage like there was in Premiere. However, if we look at the drop-down of the available transforms, we can see that After Effects does have the ability to automatically interpret footage recorded in log. So if we select the option to interpret the footage as slog3, we can see that After Effects does indeed perform the conversion correctly. However, if we now go back into Premiere and we compare these two clips, we can see that the colors of the clip that was interpreted natively in Premiere are very different from the colors of the clip that we sent through After Effects. And again, these are the same clip. They should look the same, but they look very different. And this is because the clip in Premiere is being interpreted using an external LUT that's not consistent with Adobe's color management system. So in this case, color is not being managed correctly between Premiere and After Effects. Now yes, we could choose to not use the automatic transform that exists in After Effects and instead manually apply the same LUT that we're using in Premiere. But at that point, we're basically just doing everything ourselves, and Adobe's not doing anything besides getting in our way. So what's the point of having a color management system if using it gives you worse results than doing everything manually? Ideally, Premiere should have the ability to automatically convert log footage without the use of an external LUT, which again is already a thing in After Effects. These transforms exist. Adobe made them, but then they just decided not to port them over to Premiere for whatever reason. Why do we have to use an external LUT when Adobe clearly has the ability to let us interpret log footage the proper way? It would solve so many problems. Why? And the problems don't even stop there because there are other problems with sending footage to After Effects as well. Okay, so watch this. I've imported this grayscale that is linear in HDR. So we can see if I look at my scopes here, everything is linear up until this point here. So that is all correct. Okay, but now watch what happens when I send it to After Effects. So we gotta replace with After Effects composition. And okay, I need to go into After Effects. I need to import and set the interpret footage, direct 2100 PQ, because that's what it's supposed to be. Then I go back into Premiere, and we can see, hang on, the scopes are different. Look at this. The clip's different. I literally haven't done anything to it besides send it to After Effects. And again, in Premiere, I'm using the built-in input transform. And in After Effects, I'm using the built-in input transform. So they should be consistent. There shouldn't be a problem here. And yet, they're different for no reason. Why? One of the main selling points of Adobe's software is their dynamic link feature, the ability to seamlessly transfer data from one application to another. But it's hardly seamless when doing it messes up the color. Now, maybe you could get around this by rendering out all of the clips before bringing them back into Premiere, but again, at that point, what's the point in having dynamic link if it breaks things? Now look, again, it is entirely possible that some or all of these problems are my fault, that I'm just doing something wrong, and there are fixes to these problems, or they're just bugs that'll be fixed in the next release. That's all entirely possible. In fact, I would love to be proven wrong about this. I would love for someone to post in the comments all of the things that I'm doing wrong, and all of the solutions to these problems and where to find them. I would love for that to happen. I'm not saying this because I hate Premiere or I hate Adobe. I want Premiere's HDR workflow to be great because I want HDR to be more accessible. I want everyone to be able to use HDR workflows just as easily as they can use SDR workflows. But I can't in good conscience recommend Adobe's HDR workflow when there are so many problems like this that are so difficult to find solutions for because they're not very well documented. If someone less experienced with HDR tried to develop their own workflow using nothing but Adobe's official documentation, then I wouldn't blame them at all for getting frustrated and just giving up, because this stuff is not user-friendly at all. I mean, Resolve's HDR workflow is far from simple, but it's better than this. I want HDR to be a common delivery standard on YouTube, but given how many people use Premiere, I think that in order for that to happen, Adobe needs to get their act together and make this workflow more robust and easier to use. So I hope Adobe gets their act together. I hope I find solutions to all these problems one way or another, and I can make that original Premiere HDR tutorial video that I wanted to. But until I find those solutions, I'm sort of stuck, and I can't recommend working in HDR if you work in Premiere. So I guess that's all I have to say on the subject right now. I hope you all enjoyed this video for what it was. My name is Cayman Crocker, signing off.